The private equity recruiting cycle is one of the craziest interview processes that there are in the world. I was actually meaning to create a primer of it to prepare you for that process, but it came and went much quicker than even I expected. In this video, we're going to talk about how the cycle has changed on a year-over-year basis, as well as some implications of that change. My name is Matt Ting from Peak Frameworks, and let's dive in. So if you're not familiar, private equity firms are investment firms, and they hire their associates, which is often the most junior role, from investment banks as well as consultancies. Now the thing is that this process has become so competitive that people are essentially getting poached right out of school. They're getting poached almost 2 years in advance of when they would actually start. Now the recruiting cycle has been pushed up so ridiculously early. It's pretty much as early as possible at this point. If we look at this graph, we can see how it's pretty much trended over the years. If you look at the 2010s, pretty much every single year, the cycle would jump up a month at a time every single year. This is because different private equity firms would try to be sneaky, they would try to undercut each other and start their processes earlier. And this was moving up every single year until 2019, in which recruiting happened in September. And then of course, COVID happened, which gave us 2 anomalous years in which recruiting was pushed back to a more reasonable time. Now to give you some perspective, I recruited back in January 2016. And even then it felt incredibly early because you essentially don't have a lot of time to do any big deals. You're still learning how to do normal financial modeling, and you haven't really been able to prove yourself or do any complicated analysis. And I think looking at this graph shows us that really the only things that will slow down recruiting, slow down the intensity of the pace of these firms, is either a recession like we saw in 08 and 09, or something like COVID, which prevents people from actually meeting in person. And we definitely saw that with this past cycle. This past cycle kicked off at the end of August. Now to demonstrate how ridiculous this is essentially a week or two after most firms are done training. And I actually heard in some situations, people were just having their very first day, literally at orientation, when they had to go to private equity interviews. In order to be ready for the on-cycle process, you have to decide pretty much in your senior year if you want to pursue this or not. I actually think the best time to do technical prep is when you're in senior year of college, when theoretically you don't have to be stressing about school as much and you should have a bit more free time. And if you don't know, we do have a comprehensive private equity course at peakframeworks.com. They'll teach you how to do modeling, how to navigate the recruiting process. It's the only course that's recommended by headhunters, and we place people into mega funds every single year. In addition to this technical prep, you also need to do the self-reflection to understand where you want to work, what city you want to work in, as well as the kind of investments you want to do. So there is some networking that I also recommend people do within their senior year, just speaking to alumni as well as their friends at firms to really best understand what they want to do. Now back to the recruiting front, more and more firms are starting to opt out of the on-cycle process. Silver Lake, which is one of the top technology private equity firms, sent an email to their headhunter essentially saying that they were not going to participate in this on-cycle process. They were essentially saying that they wanted to make better hiring decisions and give candidates a greater opportunity for them to explore whether they want to do private equity or not. Now, one big caveat here I would say is that Silver Lake has one of the best analyst programs. They hire several analysts every single year with the intention of promoting them to associates. So for them, associate recruiting is really on a relative basis not as important. However, the difficulty with the process being so early is that they can't even tell if their analysts want to stay or not. A lot of the times, private equity analysts will leave to go to hedge funds, leave to go do other things, and as such, it's very difficult for a firm like Silver Lake to plan for their headcount. So the largest mega funds still do on-cycle recruiting. If I had to predict, I would think that they still are always going to do it because there is this perception that the top candidates will still go into on-cycle. The people with the best resumes still get snapped up during the on-cycle process, and I think for a lot of the largest funds who know they have that cachet, they don't mind still going into on-cycle and taking those candidates. Now, another observation, having spoken to my peers who are at these private equity firms, there is unfortunately a greater emphasis on a lot of the resume type details. Now, what I mean by that is your GPA, the school that you went to, the bank that you're at, and a lot of assessment of raw intellect. And that's because it's difficult or near impossible to ask someone about their deal experience. Maybe you had a little bit of work experience when you're an intern, but by and large, there's not enough finance experience to really ask you about. Now, unfortunately, I think a lot of non-targets actually lose out as a result of this. They aren't given the opportunity to get good deal experience or for the interview to be substantially more technical. And unfortunately for most of us, I think this does mean there's a greater emphasis on Ivy League schools as well as that traditional prestige. Because a lot of the times, these people at private equity firms, they just don't want to screw up. They want to maximize their chances of getting a reasonably competent person. And if you don't have work experience to look at, it's a lot safer to just pick the kid that went to the best school. And then the last thing I'll say is about the increased transparency that has been brought to the private equity process. And it actually is a little bit of a double-edged sword. When you have accounts on Instagram like Liquidity, as well as people like me emailing all my students as soon as there's any whisper of recruiting information, it gets disseminated extremely quickly. The headhunters will immediately tell their clients, and a lot of the candidates are going to be in the social media audience who also see what's happening. So the level of anxiety is essentially much higher, and it's a lot harder to keep a secret in the industry these days. Now, the biggest implication I think here is that headhunters actually have even more power than they did before. That's because there will be no point of contact to the firms themselves. You pretty much only have your headhunter interview to rely on. There used to be a process in which firms would go through resumes and screen themselves, but now it's pretty much who did well in the headhunter interview, please send them our way. So yes, private equity recruiting is ridiculous, and unfortunately, if you want to be in the industry, it's just something you'll have to deal with. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.